Those with borderline personality disorder, beware. Your whining about how people need to treat you all warm and fuzzy while you're abusing them isn't welcome here, nor any other of your feeble-minded comments about what you wrongly think people owe you. I will cheerfully delete such comments and block you from commenting here again. Now, to my intended audience. My talk today is once again about borderline women. I've done a few of these talks in the past, and in doing them, I've noticed a couple of distinct trends in your comments. One is that a lot of you, perhaps most, have experienced some relationship hell with women who behave consistent with borderline personality disorder. And two, men in this channel's threads have posted with some regularity that the characteristics associated with borderline personality disorder are similar or identical to what they have experienced with women generally speaking. In other words, for many men, women in borderline, same. I make it a habit here to explore questions that most other people won't, and what I've seen in the comments literally begs the question. Is the current female psyche in its normal state akin to a mental illness? Specifically, is there a crossover, an overlap between personality-disordered behavior and typical behavior in women that blurs or even erases the line between what we call female and what we call crazy? It's a difficult question. So difficult, in fact, that simply asking it will put the social justice crowd into panic mode. They will interpret any sort of pontificating on the subject as misogyny. Then again, SJWs will see misogyny in a tortilla if you let them stare at it long enough, so they aren't the most reliable informants. For the record, though, this isn't a misogynistic exploration. As I've said in dozens of my talks thus far, you can't make any critique of women that does not include the culpability of men in the equation. For instance, for every gold-digging shitbird with tits in the world, there is some schmuck in a jewelry store buying her a tennis bracelet. You can't just place the singular blame on women who act like whores when they live in a world where men fight with each other to stand in line and act like Johns. Well, I guess you can, but to me you look really silly doing it. The male and female psyches are co-creations, totally developmentally intertwined. Whatever I have to say about women in this talk invariably comes with the caveat that men's complicity and enabling is part of the picture. And of course, there's no way to take my opinions and legitimately apply them to the general population. Honest, scholarly investigation of whether the average woman is mentally ill, much less personality disordered, by virtue of her sex, will never happen in the foreseeable future. The best I can hope to do is to take the Diagnostic Criteria for borderline personality disorder and compare it to my own life experience with women. In doing so, I will employ the 9 elements of Diagnostic Criteria as described in the DSM-4. As I've noted in previous videos, I opt for the DSM-4 information over the more recent DSM-5. In my opinion, the DSM-4 is influenced less by feminist ideologues and provides clearer, more accurate and understandable descriptions than the DSM-5. On each of the 9 criteria, I will use a rating system of 0 to 5, with 0 reflecting an absence or near absence of a given criteria in my personal experience with women, and 5 reflecting a consistent or nearly consistent presence of particular traits of borderline personality as outlined by the DSM-4. I'll disclose in advance that, to my knowledge, I have never been in a relationship of any length with a patently borderline woman. That is not to say I have not had my share of behavior from women that I thought was totally freaking nuts. I certainly have. And while I invite you to listen to this talk and to come up with your own score, I don't suggest it will address all or most of the problems that relationships with women can visit on your lives. This is just for fun and education, guys. With that, the DSM-4 describes borderline personality disorder as a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image, and affects, and marked impulsivity beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts as indicated by 5 or more of the following. 1. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Note, do not include suicidal or self-mutilating behavior covered in Criterion 5. I had to give this one a 4. I have never been with a woman for any length of time who did not display at least some resentment of my life activities that were not centered around her. Part of this one may be a subjective guess on whether behavior is driven by fear of abandonment versus the narcissistic need for dominance and control. In this case, though, I think we are engaging semantics. Whether it is the classic borderline fear of abandonment or the raging narcissist's effort to seat herself in the center of the universe, both will interpret your rejection of their perceived needs as a form of abandonment. And, after all, it isn't saying much for a woman if we have to stop and qualify that her actions are more like a narcissist than a borderline, that her pain over imagined abandonment is actually narcissistic wounding. To anyone red pill, it's a difference that doesn't matter in the least, and there's no reason it should matter. Moving on to Criterion 2. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. For the first half of this question, the part about unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, I could have tossed out a 3 or maybe even a 2. I assume some of my previous relationships fit that mold of instability and intensity, but as I never allowed women's past relationships to play an active role in my thing with them, it wasn't that much of an issue. The first part, anyway. However, the extremes of idealization and devaluation is a 5+. I've known very few women who didn't become, on some level, petty and vindictive when not getting their way. That pettiness and vindictiveness was invariably accompanied with devaluation, just as my being lauded was assured when I was behaving consistent with their desires. At least that last part was true in the honeymoon period at the start of a relationship. After a while, of course, the positive reinforcement was dropped, revealing a sense of privilege that had been barely disguised early on. I give this one a strong 4. Criterion 3. Identity disturbance. Markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. I am giving this my first 5. I have met very few women who were in possession of a stable self-image. That includes my socialization with women outside the realm of sexual relationships. I have met a few, all of them red pill, and even then, exceedingly rare. I must note here that my interpretation of the DSM's terms are probably more expansive than what was intended by the authors. That comes down to how I measure things like self-image and sense of self. In fact, I doubt if the DSM's authors gave much thought at all to the implications of self-image and sense of self where it concerns the average female psyche. I interpret self-image and sense of self to individuals who generally operate from a distinct personal worldview, guided by a set of core values or beliefs that are consistently and predictably expressed in behavioral terms. Of course, the values sometimes change, but not situationally, according to personal advantage. They change as a result of personal evolution, maturity, and learned experience. Women who operate under those rules are rare. And to be frank, so are men. I would give them a 4 on this criteria, only 1 point less than women. The difference here for me is that for men, I've seen a lot of values without firm roots where it concerns pussy and money. That's where most men I have known go from being predictably principled to predictably untrustworthy and often quite stupid. And it's a bit ironic, this thing with men on pussy and money. Men are foolish with the latter where it concerns the former. In my experience, though, logic and values have a much stronger hold on the other parts of men's lives, which is why I've given the extra point to women, whose values I've seen slide into the gutter over everything from vacation plans to what's for dinner. I've met very few women in relationships who were guided by any values at all when it came to getting their way, with the possible exception of women for whom getting their way was the value. They weren't exactly rare. Nor were women whose moral compass failed to prevent them from inflicting some level of punishment on any man who doesn't give them what they want. Now, this is either highly unstable identity or it's pure sociopathy in action. In choosing to interpret this as an issue of identity and self-awareness rather than a pathological lack of morality, I'm being generous. Either way, the conduct fits the diagnostic criteria. We can move on. Criterion number 4. Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, e.g., spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. Note: do not include suicidal or self-mutilating behavior covered in Criterion 5. My personal experience with this one leaves me to assign a 1. With the exception of binge eating, I have encountered more men with these issues than women. In my younger days, I was more reckless with substances and sex than the women I knew. Of course, your results may differ. If so, I'll hope you'll share it in the comments. Criterion number 5. Recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. I am going to give this one my first and only 0. I take it that part of this was also a function of my personality. Even in my bluest of blue pill days, I never had a woman threaten to kill herself. I knew guys who this happened to, all of them much more steeped in the white nightlife than me. I am assuming that my less than warm and fuzzy reaction to other forms of manipulation probably prevented things from escalating to suicide threats. This and the fact I never had a woman I was involved with self-mutilate bolsters the idea that I probably was never with a full-blown borderline. That takes us to item number 6. Affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood, e.g., intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, or anxiety usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. Dysphoria, for those of you who don't know, is psychobabble for being miserable. It is the opposite of euphoria, and it is often accompanied by general irritability, which could be called a euphemism for being bitchy. These miserable, bitchy periods can be very transient or linger for a while. Let's see. Moody, miserable, bitchy. Can you say 5? Sure you can. Time for criterion number 7. Chronic feelings of emptiness. I'll be very generous again and say 3 on this one. It's hard not to say 5 again since we just went over moody, miserable, and bitchy, which, like the lack of core values, are things I normally associate with personal emptiness and with being female. Still, the question here was of chronicity. I have been in relationships with more than a few women who did not appear to be plagued with chronic emptiness. Only when things weren't the way they wanted them did the symptoms of the mental anguish manifest. That was a lot of the time, life being the way it is and all, but I would not qualify it as chronic. A lot of this is dependent on the environment as well. I've had quite a few women straight up dump me when they discovered I couldn't be controlled, or when they figured out that I found their lack of core values to be repugnant. I'm sure some of them felt temporarily empty over that, which is ironic, because watching a woman walk away because she could not handle my insistence that she act like a grown-up and treat me like one was always fulfilling for me. Criterion number 8. Inappropriate intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, e.g., frequent displays of temper, constant anger, recurring physical fights. I'm really pretty torn about this one, mainly because I don't subscribe to the same views as the authors on anger and control. They're referring to a lot of loud, aggressive behavior here, even physicality, as though it is the epitome of poorly handled anger. Certainly, it's one dysfunctional way to express anger, but it's not nearly the only way, and probably not the most destructive in the long run. If we were to include some other forms of anger, this would put me at a 5 with most of the women with whom I've been involved sexually. Most of it came in the form of psychological abuse, some so intense as to be rightly called emotional terrorism. I've known women who refused to express any level of anger directly, but would instead plan an emotional ambush or employ false accusations in a social setting that could very well have dangerous results. I've known a couple of women who executed elaborate plans to inflict maximum emotional pain for the slightest of grievances. They were quiet, cunning, and calculated, but they would probably not fit the criteria that I have agreed to use here. A small minority of the women were physically violent, so I give them a 2 on this one. Finally, we have criterion number 9, transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. This is another 1. This one, admittedly at the deep end of the borderline pool, is one that I've been spared. Mind you, I've heard some really crazy shit from women. I've watched them produce the most bizarre rationales for getting their way. I've seen them manufacture whole warehouses full of batshit crazy in their quest to prove themselves right, or at least to deny that they were wrong. I've watched them argue their points, contradicting themselves, time after time, then contradicting the contradictions for good measure. And I've watched them look puzzled when I started laughing at the comedy they were providing. As totally nutso as all this is, none of it really rises to the level of paranoid ideation or dissociative episodes, at least not in my experience. It was always more like dealing with a 4-year-old who, caught with their hand in the cookie jar, denies they were after the cookies and tries to make you feel bad for accusing them. So with that, I conclude the comparison of diagnostic criteria to the women I've been involved with over the span of my life. That criteria specified that to qualify as a borderline personality, that you have to meet 5 or more of the items listed. Counting the 3 I issued on item 7, the composite of the women with whom I have had relationships qualifies for the diagnosis. The other 4 positives were very strong, ultimately providing me some of the best motivation for red pill philosophy I've ever had in my life. So, gents, in my experience with the female psyche as it plays out in relationship life, the one word that sums it up better than any other is borderline. Again, that is not a condemnation of women in general. It's just an honest account of my experience, with me taking full responsibility for my own role in creating and enabling so much bullshit in my life. That personal responsibility is the best thing to have ever happened to me. The fact is that if I indulged myself in the latitude to only measure the last 20 years, the outcome would have been very different. Not that it would paint a rose garden picture of my life, far from it, but it would take me completely out of the realm of dealing with a lot of crazy borderline shit, which I used to think was just an inevitable part of life with women. When I quit whining and got to work screening, things changed. I have come to the conclusion that that change can happen for anyone who wants it. And that is it for today's talk. As always, I hope you've enjoyed, and see you next time.